On today's program, we're going to talk about the mysterious prophecy of Gomer. In Genesis chapter 10, the scripture says that the sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. Some of those names seem vaguely familiar. And the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, and Ripha, and Togarmah. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me, I guess, what we shall call a girl named Gomer.
A girl named Gomer. Except that here in Genesis 10, Gomer is a man. And you know, J.R., you'll find Gomer's...
It's kind of like a boy named Sue, isn't it?
It is. But a mysterious name, and we're going to be looking at what Gomer means, both etymologically and historically. But it's fascinating. You can find Gomer's name 5 times in the Old Testament. And those 5 times, he is the patriarch, shall we say, of those tribes who became Europeans in general. You just read from Genesis 10, 2, and 3. Japheth, of course, is the main progenitor of the Gentiles. Gomer, his first son, had 3 children listed here. Ashkenaz, who is basically Eastern Europe, Rephath, who is Southern Europe, and Togarmah. And the tribes of Togarmah started out in Asia Minor, but then they migrated all the way up through Northern Europe, even into Finland.
They're the progenitors of the Ugaritic language.
The so-called, Ugaritic or Finno-Ugric language, which is a very distinct language group that originated in Mesopotamia, but is spoken by the Finnish people today.
And different from European.
Quite different.
Which really makes it distinct, doesn't it?
Very distinct and traceable.
Now, let's talk about these 3 sons for a moment. You said Japheth was the progenitor of the Gentiles, and Europe in particular. Ham was the one who went down into Africa, and Shem toward the Middle East and Far East.
That's right.
And so we have 3 basic races today. Generally, I would say that the Caucasians are from Japheth, and in particular from Japheth comes these children that are so important today to the fulfillment of Bible prophecy.
They're very important, and by the way, linguists call the sons of Japheth Indo-European, and the Indo-European language is the base language for all of the languages from Mesopotamia all the way up through Europe, including the Latin languages, including the Slavic, including the Finno-Ugric, which we just talked about, the Germanic, and so forth. And so when we mention Gomer, it's very clear we're talking about Europe in general, and 5 times, as I mentioned, Gomer is mentioned, as I mentioned before, Gomer is named in the Old Testament as this kind of a patriarch of Europe. But the 6th time, and his name is found only 6 times in all of the Old Testament, and the 6th time, it doesn't refer to him at all, but rather a woman of all things.
Now, Gary, Hosea is told to marry a prostitute named Gomer.
Yes.
Most commentaries would say this is unlike God. Surely she was pure as the driven snow when they first met. Now, what's your take on this?
Well, as I read this, I believe that God literally instructed Hosea, as we find it in Hosea chapter 1, verse 2, and the Lord said to Hosea, Go, take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms. J.R., it sounds to me as though she was established as a streetwalker or prostitute. She was already in whoredom or harlotry at the time God gave the instruction.
God works in mysterious ways, His wonders to perform.
And you know, the prophets are often given very distasteful tasks. You never wish to be a prophet.
Yes.
Prophets get pulled in two, like Isaiah was sawn asunder, and they've been boiled in oil, and they have been stoned to death, and they've been killed, and they've been asked, like Ezekiel was asked, to do very distasteful public
Generally
things.
Misunderstood by their contemporaries.
They really are. But here the prophet Hosea, who was no doubt a clean and upright man, following the will of God, was instructed to take Gomer, a wife of whoredoms. Now what we have here, I think, is an allegory. That
Pure and simple.
Pure and simple. It's a story similar to Pilgrim's Progress, where Pilgrim is typical of all Christians. His progress or his pathway is typical of all the pathway of all Christians, and the various things he encounters on his pathway are typical of the Christian walk. Here we have a story about Hosea the prophet. His name means salvation, by the way, interestingly enough.
Yes. It comes from the same root word from which we get the word Yeshua, or the name of Jesus. It's amazing. Gary, one of the important things about this allegory, as we've referred to it here, is that this story is true. Now, what most theologians try to do is separate true stories from fables. Fables can be allegories. True stories, they say, cannot be allegories. But Gary, this is an allegory. This is a true story allegory.
Absolutely.
And by the way, all of God's allegories are true stories.
That's absolutely correct. Now, let's get the names. We have the prophet Hosea, salvation. He's instructed to take a wife, Gomer. Now, her name suggests Europe and the geographical location of Europe. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Gomer is the daughter of a man named Diblaim. And Diblaim in Hebrew means a pressed cake of figs, that they would take these figs and press them down into a cake, and that's the way they would preserve them. Well, this is an allegory for Israel, because Israel itself is the fruit of the fig tree.
Only a fruitcake would name his daughter Gomer, right?
True enough. And, you know, we have the prophecy in Jeremiah, chapter 24, that talks about how Israel is figs from a tree. And there are good figs.
Type of Israel, yes.
Type of Israel. Good figs and bad figs. The bad figs will be thrown away. The good ones will be brought back and planted in the land.
Jesus referred to the fig tree as Israel in Matthew chapter 24. And he said one day that fig tree will come to life again.
Yeah.
So the fruit of the fig tree is Gomer.
Absolutely.
She's the daughter of the fruit.
She is indeed. And yet at the time of this prophecy, she's in sin.
Yes.
Now, it's fascinating to point out that her name in Hebrew, Gomer, means completed, finished, something which is all finished. And so she's a prophecy of that which begins in corruption but is completed in salvation. Hosea, whose name means salvation, marries her.
So he saves her.
He saves her. And then they have children, the first of whom is a young man by the name of Jezreel, which is, again, a name that lends itself to this allegory, because Jezreel is the Hebrew word that means to sow or to scatter out, the action of sowing seed, as you throw seed across the landscape. And so it refers to the process of scattering, but it also has a double meaning. It means to plant so that things will grow up for harvest. It means both to scatter and then to gather the harvest. And it speaks of Israel's initial scattering followed by the harvest in the latter.
So Jezreel has a near and a far fulfillment.
Absolutely.
The near fulfillment came in 721 BC when the Assyrians scattered the northern tribes into captivity. And the final fulfillment?
Well, the final fulfillment comes in the fact that Jezreel is a geographical location in the center of Israel. It's a long valley, sometimes referred to as the Valley of Megiddo, the Valley of Jezreel, or the Valley of Esdraelon, which is a huge geographical location that separates northern and southern Israel today. But J.R., in Revelation 16:16, it's called Armageddon. And so Jezreel's name is typical not only of the scattering of the people, but also the final battle of Armageddon, in which the people will once again be put into their land.
You know, Gary, if we go back to the days of Naboth's vineyard and Ahab and Jezebel, Naboth's vineyard was at Jezreel.
That's right.
And right up next to the palace of the king. It was out of a window of that palace that Jezebel was thrown to her death.
That's right.
And so Jezreel has a tremendous allegorical significance, a prophetic significance of the end time. Draw it together for us.
And in fact, Jezebel was a Tyrian princess from a Gentile family, merchant traders and bankers who married Ahab, and she is typical of Mystery Babylon the Great.
Babylon.
Yeah.
and she's going to find her demise at Armageddon.
Jezreel.
How plain could it be?
Well, that's the name of their first son. And we're coming up to a break right now, but Hosea and Gomer also have two other children whose names are allegorical.
Hosea had a wife named Gomer, and as her name implies, she, being a prostitute, went after other lovers. You know, the story centers around Jezebel and Ahab and Naboth's vineyard and Jezreel, and Hosea is weaving all of this allegory into the eventual story. It seemed like Gomer was trying to be another little Jezebel, wasn't she?
Absolutely. Gomer was trying to enjoy finding pleasure elsewhere, which is exactly what Israel tried to do from the Assyrians, from the Egyptians. They have three children. The first one we've talked about is called Jezreel. The second, Lo Ruhamah, means no mercy. God is getting ready to judge his people, and this child is typical of that judgment that's coming. And that's a daughter. The third child is a son. His name is Lo Ami, which means no, not my people, no people of mine. And that's the implication. In other words, you people have sinned. And by the way, in the days of Hosea, the 10 northern tribes had totally gone over to Canaanite religion. They had mixed it all through Judaism and syncretized it, and they were worshiping idols, and they were worshiping the Baalim and Ashtoreth, the fertility goddess, and so forth. And God said, if you don't give it up, you're going to be judged. Well, to make the story short, they were judged. 721 BC, they were scattered throughout the Assyrian landscape and to places unknown. I think they went up into Asia Minor, possibly up into the area of Scythia, the house of Togarmah. I think they ended up in the land of Gomer. And they were followed later by the two southern tribes. By the way, Gomer's first son, Ashkenaz, back in the Table of Nations, became the name for Europe, and particularly for the Germano-Slavic region of Europe, where the Ashkenazic Jews ended up just before they were called back home in the Holocaust.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that some of the Orthodox Jews today call themselves Ashkenazis?
That's right.
And to me, it's like they're admitting we're the offspring of Gomer. We're Gomer's kids.
Gomer's kids, yeah.
Or at least we know that they are not genetically Gomer's kids. But Hosea's wife ended up in whoredoms or prostitution, and her poor children suffered until finally one day, in the end of her prostitution, she ended up as a slave, being sold on the slave markets, and Gomer went and bought her back.
Hosea went and bought her back.
I'm sorry, Hosea went and bought her back. That, to me, is the most profound of this entire story.
And that's exactly what happened to the 12 tribes. Eventually, they ended up in Europe, and J.R., you remember historically, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Jews of Europe said, we are Europeans. And in fact, the Jews of Germany said, we're better Germans than the native Germanic peoples. We make better Germans than they do. We're the top citizens in the country. They'll never be able to cast us out. We are here. This is where we're going to stay. They even developed the Yiddish language, which is German written in the Hebrew character set. And they had taken root, or so they thought, in the land of Gomer. And that's exactly what this prophecy is about. They had apostatized or become harlots in the land of Gomer, and God said, not so fast.
And so the Holocaust was a lo hurama, no pity.
No pity.
A third of the world's Jewish population were slaughtered during the days of World War II. Pitiful, pitiful.
Terrible.
But listen to chapter 2 of Hosea, verse 14. Therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak comfortably unto her. And I will give her her vineyards from thence and the valley of Achor for a door of hope. And she shall sing there as in the days of her youth, and as in the days when she came up out of the land of Egypt. In other words, They're coming back home to the promised land.
Coming back home.
1948, isn't it?
This is exactly when this happened. And by the way, the very next verse that you came to there was the 16th verse, and it shall be at that day, saith the Lord, thou shalt call me Ishi, which means my man or my husband, and shalt call me no more Ba'ali, which means my master. Mm-hmm. That's the day of the new covenant, when the covenant written on the heart of Israel. And I think we're at the edge of that time right now. We're talking about a timed prophecy here.
So Gomer fell into sin right down to the end of herself, and that's when he bought her back.
Bought her back.
With a price he paid. Yeah. What a price.
What a price.
And he brought her home and became her loving husband, no master. Mm-hmm. That's incredible.
And I'll tell you what else is incredible, J.R., and that is that she did not earn her way back.
It was by grace, wasn't it?
It was by grace.
Wow.
By grace are you saved.
That's neat. Well, Gary, this allegory here, and it has to be an allegory. There's no other way to explain it.
It is an allegory. Let me review it very briefly. We have Hosea, whose name means salvation, instructed to marry Gomer, whose name means completed. And God considers us completed even when we're in sin. He knows the end from the beginning. We have the father of Gomer, Diblaim, cake of figs, meaning Israel. We have Jezreel, the son whose name means scatter and regather and Armageddon. We have Lo Ruhamah, no mercy. Lo Ami, no people. And all of these children, in the end, signify the regathering. Jezreel is Armageddon, when the people are victorious over the nations. Lo Ruhamah becomes Ruhamah, I will have mercy. Lo Ami, in the end, becomes Ami, you are my people.
So he changed the children's names after he bought her back.
That's right. He sure did.
That's great.
And I have to, this wouldn't be complete without talking about Hosea 5:15, where referring to the Lord, I will go and return to my place till they acknowledge their offense and seek my face. In their affliction, they will seek me early. Mm-hmm. And you know, they did have that terrible affliction in the Holocaust. The people were in the land of Gomer, and they thought they had taken root there, and God said, no, I have plans for you back in your own land. Mm-hmm. And then Chapter 6 of Hosea, come, let us return to the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He hath smitten, he will bind us up. After 2 days will he revive us. In the 3rd day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. One of the great prophecies in all of Scripture.
After 2 days, could that be after 2,000 years? It seems obvious that it is, because in the previous chapter, he talks about the first advent of Christ as a young lion of the tribe of Judah, and going back home as he did in Acts chapter 1, and not returning until they acknowledge their offense. And now as we approach the beginning of the next millennium, we see Israel in the perfect position as Gomer to be bought back, brought back home, and with loving, kind words. God is going to woo her back, isn't he? Or Jesus is going to woo her.
Actually, the Messiah Hosea that she never knew. Jesus, Yeshua, whose name means Jehovah is salvation, is the final outworking of this prophecy, because the prophet Hosea is only a partial representation of the full work of Yeshua, who is the real husband.
Wow. And so in chapter 12 of Hosea and verse 10, he says, I have also spoken by the prophets, I have multiplied visions and used similitudes by the ministry of the prophets. In other words, he is saying here, this is an allegory. He uses the word similitudes. Chapter 14, verse 1, O Israel, return unto the Lord thy God, for thou hast fallen by thine iniquity. What an invitation. At the end of every sermon, there is an invitation. At the end of Hosea, there is an invitation here.
Absolutely.
And then he concludes this book by saying in the very last verse of the last chapter, who is wise? And he shall understand these things. That means it's something to be covered up and hidden until the end time, and those who are wise can uncover the truth of this great prophecy.
And the wife of harlotries named Gomer, whose name means completed, is completed at last. She's taken back and she is saved.
We live in those days. We are soon to see. We know Gomer is back home. We are soon to see redemption.